to the Adapting Places podcast. This is an episode I'm re-recording because I'm trying a new thing, a series discussing what I'll be calling digital place branding rules. And I'm doing these as I walk around the place I live in, just to keep things grounded and not overly theoretical. I think it helps me with my thinking. But the first time I recorded it yesterday, turned out I was on mute the whole time on the conference call tool I'm using to record this. But I enjoyed it. I'd call that a prototype. It definitely helped me shape my ideas, which is one of the reasons I think that this format will really help me personally. So obviously, if you're listening out there, you're a place brand manager, or you deal with anything related to place, might not be necessarily the long-term brand strategy. You might be involved with some of the marketing, some of the promotion, or straight selling. Might be helpful to you, but it's helpful to me to refine my ideas and make them more practical. I've been on my PhD journey now for, this is the 4th year, the 6th in a part-time study. So I think it's important now that all of the thinking that I've done to start being brought back to reality. And I'm doing this by trying to share practical tips that are coming actually from my day job, but also I'm doing the walks as I'm talking. This makes me think about the structure of these, so I'm gonna not stop myself going into segues that pop into my head as I'm walking, because I think this is where some of the real sweet spot for this kind of format is in. And if you want an edited podcast, by all means, the Place Brand Leaders podcast is where you should be going. This is where we structure things. We talk to experts. I'm helping to produce that with Florian at the Place Brand Observer. Big thanks. But I think here I'll use that to discuss things, but also get sidetracked, and that's fine. So the first two things that kind of popped into my head as I was talking about the walking and talking is that recently I saw in a paper about what's called digital placemaking, that some of the ideas about location-based services that are provided on the spot, like in a very basic example, Google Maps, and how Google Maps has now moved to offer what's near me in a place-by-place basis, like neighborhoods. They split. So it was discussing how some of the more philosophical discussions from earlier times around understanding what's in a city by doing purposeful wandering or drifting could be useful. And I didn't realize that that's what I'd been doing for a long time, and that long time coincides with the time I've been doing my PhD mainly, because it seems that when you have ideas just in your head without any movement, it can create anxiety, unnecessary anxiety. And the act of movement, even if it's not related to the conceptual ideas, seems to relieve that unnecessary tension, what I've been calling kind of buzzing in my head. And given that I'm, what I do for a living in my day-to-day is also making me glued to the screen. I'm a user experience researcher, so there's a lot of screen time. I don't think that's the best possible way to just sit and receive information and not have bodily movement associated with that. I don't think it's healthy. So that's the first sidetrack, and I think the other one was just the kind of the rationale for the structure of this, linking it all the way back to Greek philosophy, where walking and talking, or peripatetics, used to be the way to teach as well. So you take a student on a walk, and then you take them around and cover all the lesson. I've actually tried that out, and if you have a circular walk, it can also represent a really nice hero's journey almost, if anyone's familiar with that, the Joseph Campbell idea of circular of a hero's story, where you start off, fight off some initial challenges, then there's a main big challenge, and after the full cycle of the hero becoming reaching their end goal. They're back in the same spot where they started, but they're now wiser. So actually, it's a different world. So I think that's kind of two of the more philosophical ideas as to why walking and recording a podcast was enticing, but also the more practical. I have a cool idea of spending the next potential lockdown by recording this when if I'm not able to go outside to actually do what I will be calling virtual reality drifting, city drifting. So we've had an increase in the development of products and services that are related to digital placemaking. So like in their very basic sense, the guided tours that you could just visit Amsterdam without going there, or just going on exploring the streets of a city. So I've had this idea of using a VR set of some sort or cheaper versions to map out my discussions and mimic what I'm doing in reality with this. So we'll see if that's interesting. And I've been thinking about combining that with a review of how I would drift through the websites representing those places as well as part of the place marketing strategy of places. And that's going to help bring to the fore more practically how some of the digital place branding rules that I've got in mind. Okay, so before I get into rule number 1, I've also got some more things on my list to mention, just to ground it into the here and now. A really current example of place promotion that I've liked is Kazakhstan accepting their Borat heritage, let's call it, after the release of the second movie, and they seem to have released a campaign that kind of uses the tone of Borat to promote the country. I think this has got legs. It's not. What if it wasn't just a stunt? And what if you don't think just about Kazakhstan, but any post-communist country that seems to have this idea that the creation of national pride should be done through megalomania and kind of bigging up ourselves because that's how it was done back in the day. It could be helpful as a way of thinking, because most of the times what Borat does is he highlights undesirable values by pretending to really agree with them as someone that's stereotypically from that part of the world. Obviously, when you think about the movie, it actually mocks Western culture a lot more than it does the Eastern former bloc. So those countries can think about what they started doing in their place promotion. Bragging that you're ranked in such and such spot for the one factor in a different ranking. Is that all that you could be doing with those rankings? I've been trying to say that ranking of places is not helpful, but actually it does have a good function. If you track your ranking as a proxy measure, that's a bit better than just monitoring your GDP or financial well-being of your country. By all means, are we improving or decreasing? But I think if you're using the reputation in the scenes, then that's tricky, because even Simon Anholt talks about reputation for countries being very stable, with the notable exception of recently America sliding down the rankings. So back to the point about Borat. My point is that I'm originally from Bulgaria. Love the country, but we know we have our own version of Borat, and that's actually been made very prominent in a book written by one of our most famous writers in the 20th century. We have the character is called Baiganyu. So he's basically Borat, but a century before, and goes on to travel the world. He's a salesman of, I think it's the rose oil, because that used to be a big kind of resource that was available in Bulgaria, and a lot of people made money doing that. So he's a salesman going around Europe, and you just cringe all the time with how his value system does not necessarily fit those of other countries, but also really what's happening is you're reflecting on the national identity of the place. Obviously, this is very risky territory, and in a tone-deaf digital social media world, you're risking a lot by doing anything like trying to use an archetypes of your culture's identity to promote values that you want by showcasing those that you don't want in a character. Because anything related to place identity is always touchy. It's a part of people's identity. So who are you to tell them things about their identity? Very, very dangerous waters. But again, why not risk it? If we're gonna see some executions of that are not tone deaf, focus on a long-term brand strategy around the values that you want to promote in your country, why not showcase the ones that you don't want? Just saying. I think that's quite an interesting topic that I don't think I can cover anymore, but I think it makes the point. Yeah, risk it. And I've got on my list something I also wanted to talk about is some of my reading recently has centered around emotion, borrowing from cognitive sciences. I've had to read a lot more for my work around human-centered design, cognitive sciences, computer sciences, and I think this is going to be a nice segue into the first digital place branding rule I want to talk about. Emotion has steadily become raised a bit higher than it used to be, and it's not always seen as a negative anymore as much as it was in some of the more prominent behavioral economics discussions around the difference between rationality and then seems to be emotion / intuition on the other side. So dual processing theories, there's many versions of those. The most prominent is from Daniel Kahneman, from his thinking fast and slow approach, whereby we supposedly have two systems in our minds, generally speaking, with an intuitive one that is error prone, and then a slow and deliberate one that can correct for some of the biases caused by the intuitive system. Now, this was my entry point into researching behavioral economics and any behavioral and cognitive science for my PhD, and because I thought my contribution would be around stereotypes of how people stereotype each other, just in the way that Borat was probably a stereotype that people have in the West of people in the Eastern Bloc. And I had experienced that myself as a Bulgarian, so I thought, people should be biased to stereotype this way because they were consistently stereotypical, at least. So every time I would meet someone and have the small talk about where you're from, which normally is like one of the first 3 questions somebody asks you, and I would say Bulgaria, and then they would ask me, "Oh, is it cold there?" And that happened so many times that I used to find it boring trying to come up with a different way of responding to that, just to keep it interesting for myself. I hate small talk. But I found out at one point that that's what was happening, in their heads, because they knew little about Bulgaria and it was far away from what they're used to, but it was close probably to something like Russia, associating with cold. But really, Bulgaria is next to Greece, and if you wouldn't ask anyone from Greece if it's cold there, right? They're Mediterranean. We're Eastern European, but they're Mediterranean. So how does that work? So geography clearly has this aspect. So that was my entry point, right? But from the dual system processing. But then I became really interested in the literature that uses emotions in the place in geography literature, and how emotion from our surroundings gets taken into feelings and memories of belonging, and then puts that into attachments, and in its most deepest, our identity, which I mentioned earlier could be something that is very deeply held by people. So we should be handling it with care anytime we use it in any of our discussions or promotions of a place. So where I'm at the moment, after reading some of that literature around emotion, and I'm mainly going to talk about works from Antonio Damasio and Lisa Feldman Barrett that focus on emotion as a type of cognition, not necessarily as something separate, but embodied, very much focusing on emotion coming in from the outside, taken into our body through our sense perception, and then that gets internalized. But then the process that I found interesting, they talk about a lot, is interoception, which is separate from what you take from the outside, but it's for body regulation, but it can affect your reality in the present moment. So affective realism is one of the words, one of the concepts that this Feldman Barrett uses to describe how we feel at the moment and how that affects our perceptions of the world. And I don't think anymore that this is useful as being thought about as, Oreo, get off the shit. Oh, my dog just made a mess of himself. Oh, you just laid down in shit. Go on. Nope. You're not gonna get any attention now. Anyway, yeah. So that's what happens when you walk and talk. So my point is that emotion, taken in as a feeling, sometimes there's a lot of the bandwidth being used by interoception, which is about the internal body regulation, that is not present in awareness. But that's not useful to be thought about as a bias, because a bias is just an outcome, and then you try to correct for it. But maybe there is multiple different ways that you reach a bias. So understanding the details of how exactly people are, how their emotion is affecting their decisions, is very important. The reason I'm interested in this is because I'm trying to contribute here with my PhD towards understanding more intuitive style decision making related to choosing where to live, and especially focusing on graduates that are more broadly associated with the works of Richard Florida around the creative class and how do you attract that. But I'm really struggling to see how I could help to study emotion through the methods that I've already chosen. There's deep interviews with graduates, and later I'll be talking to experts and practitioners about how they attract people. So I'm trying to see how the decision making works from both sides, and the matches and mismatches. So I think that's a very good way to bring it to place branding. Rule number 1, digital place branding. Rule 1 is you should build empathy with the users of your digital place branding communication. Now you can see I'm sticking to branding, even though communications tend to be classified as marketing materials, but I still think place brand management is the process of the long-term brand strategy. Marketing is about trying to find people that match with that. They would vibe with it. So I'm going to stick to that terminology. But I'm, as you can see, bringing in terminology and ways of thinking from digital user experience design, which is my day job, as I mentioned, where I've been thinking how the methods that were originally used in marketing economics have basically been used into creating digital interfaces for people, but that's mutated a little bit. So now if we bring it back into something that's more marketing related, then what can we learn? And the ways that digital designers build empathy with users has been eye-opening for me. Market research has often focused on quantitative studies and sometimes focus groups for new products, whereas in the digital world, the qualitative in-depth methods of seeing how people interact with a prototype and then another iteration, and finding more, I've really found eye-opening. So the key things, in the most practical way about how to build empathy with users of your, I'm going to use an example just to make it more practical. Your city's, let's use the visitor website because that's easiest to think about rather than any of the other ones that might have some function where, if you're a public organization, you're providing a service on there as well. That's, not necessarily in the realms of place branding, but actually in public administration. So let's just keep those to the side. Your visitor website. The thing that you could do is just get 5 people, give them a scenario to achieve a goal on your website, and observe in detail how they go about looking to satisfy that goal. Within the design, it's by now understood that these 5 people might find as much as 80 to 90% of any of the problems with the interface, but that's not something that seems to be well accepted in boardrooms, right? How can 5 people, it's just 5, how do you generalize from 5 people? But the amount of observations you're going to see from 5 people can get up to 100, instances of clicks and instances of where they go. But for you to also see it and have the footage of that, because now you can record that, you can do it remotely, that can influence people at the decision-making table. So sometimes what I've used is actually not just me speaking and saying, this is what I've seen a user do. You just have to let decision makers see some of the pain points that people are experiencing. Just feel it for themselves, and you let them watch for 2 minutes how someone is trying to go to the home page and they can't find it. Because this then links to a bodily experience for a decision maker rather than getting them into a discussion with you and a potential disagreement. So you can justify design recommendations and make your digital place branding experience more usable. Of course, you can see here I'm talking about usability. That doesn't necessarily mean the content. That's going to come in another rule. But for now, build empathy with your users by selecting 5 people, doing a remote session where they share their screen, you observe, and then note down all the pain points, instances of them, present those to decision makers, and then, of course, make amends and iterate onwards and onwards. Whew, I just slipped. Oh, almost fell down again. Oh, dangers of the job. Whew, occupational hazards of walking and talking. Imagine if I had chewed gum as well as that. Right, I'm back at the end of my walk. So, do I feel like a hero that's been on a hero's journey, come back and learn something? Definitely didn't expect to say some of the things that I did, because I was again just going off on one. I guess that's what I was doing sometimes. But I hope that the rule that I introduced, well, let's call it a rule of thumb. Of course, I'm going to be dramatic about calling the rules, but they're rules of thumb. Hope that's useful to you all, and I'm going to create a series of these talks. So I hope you've enjoyed it, and I'll talk to you next time.